Right. Welcome back, everyone, to the afternoon session of the Task Force on the Implementation of the Pupil Weighting Factors Report. Today is Friday, the 19th, still of November, and we are going to start off with a discussion about small schools grants and merger grants. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim Demaray and Catherine Benham to take us through these options or issues.
Great.
Go for it. Thank you.
Well, for the record, Jim Demaray, that's counsel,
Catherine, joint fiscal.
and I think you start.
Okay, so Jim and I worked through, we have a one-page document on small school support. And so let's just talk about current law. So we're all in the same place. There are small schools that qualify, and there's two ways they can qualify. Quantitative, if they have a small class size. And then there's a qualitative measure where the state board determines it based basically on how inhospitable the travel routes are and their academic excellence. There's a whole range of provisions about that. So that's one set of schools. That's existed, it's modified, but that's existed for quite a while. There's been something out there for quite a while. Then there are the voluntarily merged schools. And the small school grant for them was converted to a merger support grant. But they still get that, and that was the Act 46 provision. And then there's the third provision that was added in last session. So that any district, including involuntarily merged schools, that received the small school grant in FY 2020 shall continue to receive that grant. So if you got a grant in 2020, you get it forever, right?
You're going forward.
Or until we change the law.
Until you change the law. Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else?
No, I don't think so. That summarizes it well. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So thinking about the future, we came up with 4 options. There's probably more depending on mix and match, but the first option would just be to keep everything as it is, keep current law. All the schools continue to get, whether they merged or not merged, and you're getting a small school grant, you just keep the current law continues forward. But I think it also depends on, you want to think about what weights you're putting in. So another option is, or weights or cost equity, however you're funding things. A second option is to eliminate all of it, just eliminate all of it. Those are the two extremes. And then there's got 2 options in between. I call them hybrid and smaller hybrid, just as a way to keep track. But the third one is eliminate the small school grant completely and replace it with a weight or cost equity payment. So make sure you've replaced it, somehow address those issues with a way. But you keep all support grants that merged schools have received. And the law is written in different places, so we're not going to get into all the detail right this second, but it depending on exactly how you want to define it, there's different places that things would be written or not written. The smaller hybrid, the difference here is it also eliminates the small schools grant. But on B, the difference there is it keeps support grants for merged schools only for districts that don't otherwise qualify for a small school weight or cost equity payment. So it's a little bit smaller provision, and it's I guess just another option. And as you think about who's going to receive aid in the future, how do you decide who gets it? Give it to them? Do you have anything to add, Jim?
I don't.
Okay.
This is really Catherine's.
Okay. So we asked JFO and Ledge Council to lay out some options, so we sort of understood the universe of what we could do, and obviously there may be other options too that they didn't think of, but now is just a sort of time to ask questions or express preferences. Senator Perchlik.
Well, I don't have a question, but I like the smaller hybrid model in that. I mean, I guess I don't know what the difference is on that because we don't know what we're suggesting, but what the difference between what the small school grant is and what would it be under the weights of equity formula. I'm sure people will have opinions based on how that comes out, but it seems like if we're gonna create a new system, we'd want that to account for all these things and not continue the small school grants. But I understand those that receive them because of the merger makes sense to keep those unless they're gonna get them anyway under this new formula. So that's why I like the fourth option.
Representative Conlon?
Yeah, I'll chime in and second that. I think otherwise we run the risk of having a district receiving both a merger support and weight or cost equity payments based on their size, which doesn't seem particularly right. I guess I would either be in favor of that, or you don't get both, you either get one or the other. And then you can sort of weigh which one is more advantageous and let it choose.
Brad, how do you like him? Anyone else want to, wait, Representative Beck?
I'm just curious if smaller hybrid B, has anybody fit that category?
Yes,
There are some, okay.
yes, there are.
Okay.
And in fact, at one point, Brad, I think you provided us a list of districts, did you not? Or was that only in my head that you did that? Our second meeting?
District second school grant.
At some point, I shared with us a document about small schools grants. Okay. I think it might have been the second meeting. Okay. But it might not have been.
Okay. There are districts that fit that category, that get the small school weight because of sparsity, that also merged. Especially if we are including schools 100 to 250 and all of the three sparsity weights, they do get it. And then there are districts that merged and would have qualified prior to merger, but then don't because they merged, and but they get the merger support grant. So the question is, do we keep any of the merger support grants or not? Anybody else have? Brad, do you want to come up to the mic, or to Conlon's mic at least?
I just took a quick look, and there are 81 schools that are less than 250 kids. So, yeah, that's the universe. And when we look at the sparsity categories, it looks like. Let me just double check it. I don't trust that. Looks like about 70 are 70 out of those 181 are qualifying under the sparsity. So we're talking about 111 roughly that are small, quote unquote small, 250 or less, but are areas that don't hit the sparsity factor.
Can you say that one more time? Sorry.
Yep. So there are 181 schools that are 250 or less enrollment. Of those, 75 meet the sparsity category from the weighting study of being in an area of 55 people or less per square mile. That leaves 111 that are larger than that.
That are currently eligible for small schools or merger or whatever we want to call whichever grant category they wound up in because of the twist of fate. Okay.
But don't qualify for sparsity.
Right.
So where are people leaning here? I've heard, I mean, Representative Kornheiser, you want to weigh in?
I just have it's a bigger picture question about the merger support grant and then whatever the thing was that came after that we just put in law last year. They were designed as a policy, as an incentive. The time has passed that they were an incentive. I know taking them away brings the feelings. And will they stay in law forever? So like, at what point is the point where we say, okay, the policy period that this was an effective policy tool is gone? So like another example that's not all laden with academic feelings is we know that the pre-K weight is totally wrong. And we know that we put it in law because it was a policy tool to incentivize the creation of pre-K a long time ago. And that it doesn't actually serve that purpose anymore. And so we're recommending that someone looks at that. This seems like a really similar scenario. The time has passed. Legislators can't promise things forever. I don't mean to wax too philosophical, but I think that's the crux of this issue. I mean, we are giving districts a double dip on the ed fund on this.
So I'll just respond to that. So if we went with one of the hybrid options, we would not be giving them a double dip because they would be getting just the small school weight. And anybody who got the small school weight, the smaller hybrid, I guess, they would not get merger support and grant. But I actually look at this as potentially a transition thing, because there are districts, and I will fully admit, one of my districts, potentially 2 or 3 of my districts that get merger support grants went through and did the hard work of merging under Act 46 and did what they were asked to do by the legislature and did it, and got the merger support grants. And if we take them away now, they are being penalized for doing what they were asked to do under Act 46. Part of what our charge is to make sure that what we do is consistent with Act 46. And these districts that merge prior to merger would have qualified for those weights. And now they won't qualify for them. So they would be penalized for doing what they were asked to do by the legislature. And it doesn't seem right to me. And so we could think of it as a sort of transition mechanism where they still, we keep them for 5 more years or something like that, or we just keep them and it becomes part of one of the categorical aid grants that we give. But getting rid of them right now is penalizing the districts that did the right thing and followed the law under Act 46.
Yeah, I just need a quick background refresher. When the merger grant supports were stood up, they were offered in perpetuity, or we just didn't say? Jim?
Yeah, so the emergency support grants are in perpetuity subject to 2 things. One is you making a different decision. And the second is,
You, Kath.
and the second is if they close the small school, then the grant goes away the next year.
If they
If they
close
close the small school.
if they close a small school. So once a school closes, their merger support grant either goes away or reduces by the amount that was attributed to that school. Or I don't know, is there a provision if a school breaks off from a merged district, which is relevant in my area?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
You lose that.
Do they lose that amount? Is that what it says in law?
It doesn't actually address that point.
Yeah.
If you uncombine what happens, but still the small school grant section still allows qualification if you meet the criteria, which is Catherine mentioned, are both qualitative and quantitative. So it's still able to get if you meet those tests.
Right,
Yeah.
as the independent small school, but not as the merged district.
Yeah, unclear under distribution what would happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyone, Cheryl,
I'm
Senator Hooker.
Thank you, thank you. I'm just looking at the chart that Brad gave us the second meeting, and there are, it looks as if there are schools that are eligible for small school adjustment, and then it says small school merger support, yes, and then it says eligible for small school weights and current law grants, yes. What does that mean? I mean, are they getting all of these?
I would have to look. Because I don't know.
I think this is Brianna's stuff.
This This was Brianna Parker's.
What date was it?
Can you send it to us, Cheryl?
I got it off the website under Sorsha has it.
September 8th?
Yeah, September 8th. So some of them say no, you're eligible for small schools.
Large.
Yeah, but then small school merger.
This is
yes.
current lessons what they're currently. Whoops. Overlap. This thing is one together.
But I'm looking at the ones that say yes all the way across, and how does that compare? You know, like whether or not they're getting both. Did they not get the small school grant anymore because they're getting the
They
merger grant?
do not get, if they get a merger support grant, they no longer get the small school grant. They're not eligible for
Okay,
it.
so this is
So
just that they're
That's just
eligible for them.
eligible.
Wait.
Yes,
So,
eligible.
yeah, okay.
Wait, well, I want to just break this up a little bit because can everyone pull it up so that we're all looking at the same thing? and Brad is answering all of our questions and not just Senator Hooker's.
Sorsha
So-
just-
Okay, so why don't you pull it up? It's also on our website on September 8th, so you can find it
It's
there.
on page 4, just so you know where we are at the moment.
Page 4. So Brad, why don't you, instead of doing that, can you pull it up or look at it? Because Catherine has it up. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Brad.
Can
I just want to make sure that we're all having the same conversation and not having a side conversation over here.
can I just say that under current law, you can't get a merger support grant and the small school grant. You can only get one or the other. So
Right.
No doubling up.
But it's not a choice. You get the merger support grant.
Right.
That's how
Right.
it works. So on page 4, the first one at the top is Caledonia Cooperative Unified School District, Barnum, Walden, Waterford. Their population density is less than 36 people per square mile. They would be eligible for a small school adjustment under the weighting study. Under current law, they voluntarily merged, so the small school grants they had prior to merger are now a merger support grant. So they get that in perpetuity until, as Jim said, you change your minds or one of the buildings closes. And then the overlap is the same, both for small school weight and current law grants. They're eligible for both, but that's what's happening. So in this case, if nothing were to change, they would get their small school grant as a merger support grant, because that's ongoing. So they get the merger support grant, plus they get the sparsity, the small school grant with due to sparsity weighting instead. So we get both.
Okay, unless we change
Unless
that. Right, okay, Representative Kornheiser.
The way you just sort of explained it, that, well, actually, both of you explained it, that, one person, you can't get both of them. And Brad, you sort of said that the merger support is more powerful, basically, like, if that's what you have, that's what you get, you don't get the other one. And so I wonder if we could, the mini option, whatever it was called, that's the page. What? Small hybrid? The small hybrid option, if that's the way to.
No, it's fine, it's totally fine.
If that's the way to, if sort of legally we stack them in terms of like which one has primacy, does that? Maybe this was an inside thought and I didn't say that.
I think the way it's currently structured is when you voluntarily merge, you got the merger support grant. That means you're not eligible for a small schools grant calculation annually any longer. With what just passed, was it Act 73? I think that,
correct,
okay, in Act 73 that said anybody who was getting a small schools, any district that was getting a small schools grant FY20 gets that small schools grant going forward. So that kind of put everybody else in that same boat, not eligible for a new calculation each year. That's they're getting what they get. The few who become eligible subsequent to that are the ones that would we'd be looking at, what's their size, did they meet the criteria, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is a hierarchy already.
So what, Kath, did you have something?
Nope.
Okay, Representative Kornheiser.
I think a direction that would be important to me is to have either the weights or the cost equity formula be the one that is the sort of most powerful. Right, and if someone qualifies for that, that's what they get, and then the rest are sort of left as, like you suggested, Senator Hardy, like legacy transition mechanisms. If we've sort of decided that this model is the most effective, I mean, hypothetically, we've decided that these models are the most effective models.
So that's smaller hybrid.
Smaller hybrid, yes.
No, it's
We
okay.
all have to make something up.
Yeah, I mean,
It's like, I don't know.
Exactly. And you were asked to do this at the last minute. So Catherine, thank you. Well, we'll come up with a better name if we choose this option in the report, so don't worry. We'll call it the Catherine Benham option. Anybody else have anything else to say about this? I guess I'm going to pause. Anyone else? I would be comfortable with the smaller hybrid. It seems logical. It's sort of modeled on what we have right now, but with a different system. And there are districts that will get less if under the weights, because the weights, have that interaction effect that the categorical aid doesn't. And under cost equity, maybe that would be made up for, or maybe not. So it's not going to be the exactly equivalent of what they would get, but logically, I think it makes sense. And I just want to make sure that districts that merged continue to get that benefit, because they won't be getting any of the weights or cost equity payments. So are we all comfortable with the hybrid, smaller hybrid?
Why wouldn't they be getting either the weights or the cost equity?
Because once they merge,
Just 'cause it's part of it.
The sparsity is calculated on a district level, so they're no longer considered a sparse, they don't qualify for the population density stuff. And if you don't qualify for that, you don't get any of the small school weight. So
They would get it if they qualify, but they're not likely to qualify because they merged.
because they merged, yeah. Representative James.
Just my only question, because you mentioned something that I was sort of starting to mildly worry about, which is, what if the schools that get the merger grant, because, as you said, they sort of, did the right thing way back when and did the hard work early on. What if there is a big drop in resources coming to them? Like, what if what they would get, can you explain to me again, what if what they would get through your cost equity is a lot less? Do they then get to keep the merger grant?
So
'Cause
not
you had
under.
suggested a hierarchy where they get it only if they no longer qualify.
So under the weights, as we've seen, the weights impact districts differently. It depends on how much they spend per pupil as to how much the weights will actually mean for them. So we would have to try to calculate it on a district by district basis and compare the merger grant to what they might theoretically get under the weights. That might be a difficult thing to do accurately. If we do the cost equity payment, it's probably an easier thing to compare. But it would be different for each district, I think. And like I said, I think there will be districts that will get more out of the weights in terms of tax capacity, or more out of the cost equity payment than they get on the small schools grants or the merger grants, but there may be others that get less. And I can't remember how the merger support grant, small schools grant is calculated. It's different in terms of the amount.
It's a very complex calculation by statute. Explain it.
But the merger support grant, how was that calculated? How was it determined how much they got?
The merger support grant looked at what those districts that had small schools that were merging. It looked at the aggregate small schools grant they all received 2 years prior to merger. And that was what they got.
And it was
going
fixed.
forward.
Yeah, so So it might be hard to determine. And the only way we would say like, which should they get is if it went from, which would they benefit more from? And that might be a little complicated to implement.
I can see how that would be complicated. I mean, complicated. I guess I would just be worried about those districts. If there would be any districts that would see a really big drop, that would be worrisome to me.
What is the range and size of the merger support grants? Some of them are pretty big and some of them are pretty small. So, but again, Representative Kornheiser, well,
So if there's, I mean, we're operating under an assumption that the study, the Pupil Weighting Factors report, told us how much districts need to cover these particular costs. And so I understand the challenges with transitions and politics of moving from the grant to something that comes out of the report. But if we are operating that the numbers in the report are accurate, then it seems to me that those should be the numbers that we operate on. And yes, some districts are going to lose grants, and I think that there should be a transition plan to do that, the same way we're mitigating any of the other big bumps that people have. But if I don't know the math that created the original small schools grant and sort of the studies that went into figuring out those costs. But it seems that if we're going to be consistent with report findings regarding costs, that we need to say that like, this is how we meet the needs of small schools. Or some, eventually. And I understand the need for a transition, and we don't want to punish districts. We don't want to, do anything that's out of keeping of Act 46 and all of those things.
yeah, I think that there were different policy purposes, and so you can't compare them. And they served a purpose, and it wasn't the same purpose as the study.
Yeah.
And therefore, it doesn't, that sort of what went behind them in terms of calculating them is irrelevant. It was really it was an incentive to do this thing that the legislature asked them to do.
Oh, I mean the small school grant, I don't mean the merger support grant.
Brad, do you have the number? Or, I mean,
I'm getting there.
okay, sorry.
That's right. Occupied. So the largest merger support grant, and I'm doing this quickly, this is not the real file. Doing it by my color coding. The largest merger support grant is $474,000. Smallest is 29,300.
Yeah, so they range a lot in size, and I think it's so district dependent as to how much it would impact them.
The smaller one was 2 districts, the other one was 6 districts.
7. Yeah, so if everyone's comfortable, at least for now, going with the hybrid, that's what we can plan, a smaller hybrid, and then we can always reconsider, although we're running out of time to reconsider things. But is there consensus, at least, that that's the right option for now? Yeah, okay. Okay. You got that, Catherine? Okay. Put it in the report, right, quick. Okay, thank you, Brad and Jim and Catherine. And we are now at 1:30, exactly. Holy cow, we are so good. We are now going to move, we're going to shift pretty strongly and start talking about another topic that that we had talked about earlier and that we would come back to, and about the about the income-based taxation. And Jeb Brighton going to join us. Great. And Representative Kornheiser wanted to say a few things.
Yeah, I think earlier this morning, we were talking about how the exact impact on the individuals that live in districts is still not clear to us. We haven't put in the common level of appraisal. We haven't talked about, how rental states will turn out differently in this. We haven't talked about, we haven't done an income yield, all of those things. And so when I think about moving to a more income-based model of funding education, I really do think of it as a way of mitigating the impacts of this transition, because from my perspective, it shifts it from a town by town approach to something that is much more based in the individual person that lives in that community's ability to pay and ability to support their schools and to get their needs met. And so that's, I know it's a huge policy change to be called something like a mitigation or a transition strategy, but that is genuinely how I think about it and where sort of fits into this conversation for me.
That being said, none of it's been modeled yet, so we don't know exactly what the impact would be. So I'm going to turn it over to Deb Brighton. She is now wearing a different hat. So why don't you introduce yourself with this different hat?
Thank you. I'm Deb Brighton from the Tax Structure Commission. And I guess I spoke to you earlier about what the Tax Structure Commission came out with, but basically, I'm not going to repeat it, but basically the main thrust of it was to move off of our hybrid system that we have now, which for the homestead, that combines a homestead property tax and an income tax, and to just go straight to an income tax for residents to pay for schools. And now that I've spent more time looking at the weights, I'm more convinced actually that the combination of your efforts and moving to the income tax base for residents could make our education finance system both fairer and simpler at the same time. When the Tax Structure Commission was working, the weighting study report was out, and we read it, and we struggled with the question of what is a cost equity issue and what is a tax equity issue, seeing our role as dealing with the tax equity side. And we used statistics also to try to tease out the relationships between various factors on spending per pupil. But we used slightly different factors than the weighting study did, because we included things like income and house site value to try to figure out what was influencing spending per pupil. And in the end, we found that the weighting study factors were more important than income and property value, house site value at this point. So what that means is we concluded that there was a cost equity problem and that it was better dealt with on the cost side with those sorts of weights. It was not as much of a tax issue, tax equity issue. And so for that reason, we think that merging your approach to cost equity with the changes that we wanted to make to the tax equity part would be like a really good match, and that we may be able to make our education finance system the most equitable anywhere in terms of both cost equity and tax equity. But we didn't have the advantage of your work at that time. And I think that the main advantage of our recommendation to go to an income-based tax for residents is not really that income's a better measure of ability to pay. That is true, but the current system does give most homeowners that option. The problem is that they don't always know it. They understand the property tax bill, and people talk about the property tax bill, and there's articles in the paper about their tax rates going up or it's going down or whatever, but they don't really understand why or how they're going to get an adjustment and what it will be and how it's connected to their vote. So the Tax Structure Commission thought that the main issue was complexity of our education tax finance system. And so the recommendation calls for simplifying it by eliminating the double structure. of the income tax or the house site tax, and going to only an income-based tax for residents. And at the same time, this would eliminate the 2-year payment that we have now, where you pay on this year's vote, you pay in 1 year, and then you get a tax credit in the following year. So you never really paid, you never really understand exactly what you're paying and why. So this would end up just being a direct income tax, voted in 1 year, paid in 1 year. So obviously we don't have a printout to show you the district by district changes that could result from either the income tax or your proposal. But I'm sort of envisioning the income tax part, simplifying the tax raising. And it would, if we incorporated it with the cost equity approach to, well, the cost equity approach that you're talking about, it would further simplify the tax raising process by eliminating the confusing equalized pupil calculation that we have now. Which, on the other hand, if you keep that in place, it will only get further confused by combining it with weights. But so I'm talking about hoping that you go the cost equity approach that could then be combined with going straight to income. And those two things together would take care of the cost equity and simplify the tax raising part. There are 2 other recommendations of the Tax Structure Commission that I just hope maybe would fit in with your recommendations. And one is looking at the education homeowner rebate program. So in doing some statistics for you when I was wearing my other hat, I did find that there are some districts with very low median incomes and high poverty levels, spending a low amount per pupil. And that, although the waiting for poverty would help these districts, it looks as though they also have an income issue. And part of this has been, we've recognized this in the statutes for, I think since the 70s, we have had a rebate program so that if the tax on your house that exceeds a certain proportion of your income, there's a circuit breaker, so you get a break. And since, at least prior to Act 60, the highest income for being able to take advantage of that is $47,000. And $47,000 in 2021 is very different than $47,000 of income was in 1990. But we didn't index it to inflation or anything. So it may very well be that in the, as Senator Kornheiser said, people are affected differently, and it may very well be that 2% of the income of people in some of these lower income areas is too much, and we should relook at that system. And I think of Thomas Jefferson said that you need to relook everything that the legislature passed in a generation, and he calculated a generation as 19 and a half years. So we're beyond that point. Maybe it's time to look at that number. And another recommendation that we found that we really felt strongly about was that because of the importance of education, the size of the education fund, and the complexity of education finance, we think there should be sort of an ongoing education tax advisory commission or committee. And the committee would monitor the system, conduct analyses and special studies, report on current status and trends, do forecasts, make annual reports to the legislature, including the recommendations for the yields and the rates every year. So that with time and study and analysis, we would build capacity of the members and also strengthen the ability of the legislature to manage the education finance system. And I think that after the work that you've all done, just on this task force, you realize the amount of time it takes to really get up to speed on the education finance system. And so if we don't have some sort of ongoing committee, every time we have a new issue, we have to sort of bring in new people to get up to speed. And I just think it would be really helpful to have that sort of stability. And I think it sort of could be like our debt affordability advisory committee. It would be maybe a mix of legislative and other knowledgeable people in the field who would advise, study, report, and advise, and add sort of some stability and some history. Yes.
1 second. Representative Kornheiser wanted to comment on this.
This last piece of recommendations, Deb, that you're sharing with us, was sort of originally intended, this is more for the committee actually than for you, Deb, was originally intended to be part of an agenda item that was scheduled this morning. That was about how essentially is our work going to be renewed on a year-to-year basis, and how we sort of continue regular forecasting and renewal, so that we don't wind up with this task force ever again. Secretary French had to reschedule, and so we moved that agenda up to our next meeting. But something like a tiny e-board or a consensus forecast or something like that is a bunch of stuff that we'll be talking about next meeting in the context of sort of, and Deb's recommendations is one of those. Tax Structure Commission recommendation, excuse me.
Tiny e-board, smaller hybrid. I love it.
If we just go in the middle, no one will notice. we're doing
Nobody
it.
will notice. Representative Beck, you have something?
I do. Deb, I'm not sure I understood. Talking about, are you saying that we should move to an all income, but also have a super circuit breaker for people that are below a certain income?
Yeah. We discussed it. Actually, we didn't want to call it a circuit breaker, but we felt that below a certain income, you would pay maybe on a sliding scale, 95%, 75%, 50%, whatever, of what you would otherwise calculate. Just because as housing incomes get to a certain point, even 2% of income becomes high.
Okay, I just want, because that would, if we set it up like that, would be dramatically different than how it's set up right now.
Yes, I should point out that right now, it's capped at, say, 2% of your income. And
Right. Posing a cap.
yeah, so
you're just-
everything above that disappears. And so one of the reasons was everybody sort of felt everyone should have skin in the game. You know, so they would still, their tax rate would go up. If you voted in a higher budget, the tax rate would be higher, just like everybody else's, but you wouldn't pay the full amount. But you still see the effect of voting in a higher amount.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anyone else at the moment? Deb, do you have more to add?
No, that was all I had. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Deb? I think, are you going to stick around or can you? For
Yeah.
Okay, just in case. Anything else at the moment? All right, we're going to move to our next witness on this topic. Well, witnesses, I think there are two of you here from the Public Assets Institute, Stephanie and Jack. I don't know if you have an order or who's going to do the speaking, but if you want to introduce yourselves and then go ahead with your testimony, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Senator Hardy. And I'm Stephanie Yu. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Assets Institute. Jack Hoffman, our Senior Policy Analyst, is with me. I'm going to do most of the talking, but he's going to help me as needed with any technical questions and that kind of thing. So, and I just want to say, I appreciate sort of this conversation and this idea that this can be sort of a a strategy both that could mitigate the transition and be an overall fairer policy. So, I think both of those things can be true. And so the timing of combining them makes a lot of sense, as Deb said. So, and the other piece that I would say is I appreciated hearing Deb's take on sort of the important findings of the Tax Structure Commission. I think for us, what we want to share with you today is a little bit of kind of a history of income-based school taxes and what we've done over the years, and then also kind of lift up a couple other pieces of the Tax Structure Commission findings that we thought were really important and relevant to this conversation. So I did submit some slides, so hopefully you all have those in front of you. There's only a handful, and some of them you've seen before, but so I'll kind of go quickly through those, but just so you all have those in front of you. So when I was last year, a couple of months ago, I did give kind of a quick overview of the education funding system. And there's 2 points that I would just remind you of before kind of digging into the income-based piece of this. So the first one is, I think if you go to that first real slide after the cover slide there, this may look familiar. So again, kind of hitting, unlike almost every other state, Vermont has this statewide education tax system. So we're all paying collectively for all the kids. And what that means is that in Vermont, how much your community can raise does not determine how much you have to spend on education. So instead, we're calibrating district tax rates so they correspond to per pupil spending. We're supporting whatever level of funding voters are choosing, but towns with higher spending have higher rates. Towns with lower spending have lower rates. So we're all contributing to that statewide ed fund. This is, again, you've seen this before. This is sort of the big pot that we all share statewide. And so we're all contributing to this statewide ed fund proportionally based on the per pupil spending we vote in our town. So then this idea that Deb was talking about, which is that resident taxpayers can really pay their school taxes in one of 2 ways, either based on their primary home's property value or on their household income. So that's that homestead slice, that 25% slice of the ed fund that you're seeing there on that next slide. And we have this income option because we've recognized for a long time that paying strictly based on property value is regressive, meaning that lower income Vermonters are paying a bigger share of their income than higher income Vermonters. And again, and for those with fixed incomes, rising property values make it tough for them to stay in their homes. So for most Vermonters, paying by income is the better deal. So if you go to that next slide, you can sort of see it's about 2/3 of homeowners versus 1/3 of homeowners paying by property value. And then there is this sort of weird, quirky area where people might be paying some of each, depending on sort of the confluence of their income and their property value. So we essentially have these 2 parallel systems for how residents pay their school taxes. And I want to just kind of walk you through quickly a little bit of the history of sort of the move to income-based taxes. As Deb was saying, this has been 50 years in the making. And in fact, back in the 1990s, when they were contemplating the redesign of the education funding system, and what led ultimately was Act 60 and 68, the House did pass a fully income-based system for residents that was rejected by the Senate. But if you go to that next slide, you can see sort of even further back to 1970, we had some version of an income adjustment, right? And who qualified sort of shifted over time. But so back in 1970, the rebate program was really aimed at precisely sort of that swath of older Vermonters who had fixed incomes but rising property values and couldn't keep up. And then in 1973, we expanded that program to low-income Vermonters. So then the next big change was Act 60 in 1997, which made a big difference. So you can see on that next slide the sort of share of households or number of households that were paying some portion, some or all of their school taxes on an income basis. And so you can see that sort of big jump that happened after Act 60. And as Deb was saying, the Tax Structure Commission did take up this question and came to this conclusion that moving to income-based was the fairest system. Because what we really have now started as a property tax, and then we just kept making it sort of messier and messier by all these different income adjustments and layering income sensitivity on it, with the idea that would help people ensure that people could afford their school taxes, which it has. It has helped people afford their school taxes, particularly lower income and those with fixed income. I think, as Deb said, we might again sort of be due for a recalibration of how we look at that, but the 2 remaining problems and Deb identified the biggest one, I think, which is that it's really complicated, right? Trying to force a property tax to essentially act like an income tax means that we're layering on all these tweaks, and that makes it that much more complicated, both for voters to understand, for policymakers to manage, and also for, the tax department to administer. So, and just briefly, the quick version of this, if you wanted to calculate your taxes on town meeting day now, you would have to know whether all the income in your household, and you all know by now that the income definition we use for this purpose is not the income definition we use for any other purpose. So you have to know if that income is above or below 90,000, and well, last year's income was above or below 90,000. And if it's below, how much of your house site value, if any, is above 400,000. If it's above 90,000, then how much of your house site value is above 225,000? As Deb said, we have this $47,000 cutoff, $47,000 cutoff for the circuit breaker. So you also have to know that. Then you have to know your homestead listed value, your house site listed value, your town's common level of appraisal, the equalized homestead property tax rate for the proposed budget, the income tax rate for your proposed budget. And then you have to do a bunch of calculations to figure out what would actually happen with your taxes. So it is incredibly difficult to follow, and I think very few people feel like they follow it or could explain it clearly, which again, sort of as you're going through the sort of direct democracy process of voting directly on your school budget and what sort of taxes you're going to have in your town, it distracts from the real conversation. It causes this frustration for voters. It distracts from the real conversation about what the schools need. And so I think, concern, and it's especially focused on this concern about property-based rates. I think, as Deb was saying, a lot of, people focus on that property tax bill because it's kind of a big shock, but also because there is a lot of coverage of sort of what's happening. Is the rate up 2 cents, down 5 cents, whatever it is. And there's a lot of focus on that, even though those property-based rates don't even apply to a lot of people. So the next slide really gets to the regressivity of the system now. So this is really an equity issue with the system, that people with the highest incomes are paying the lowest share of their income in school taxes. So, if the state average is 2.6, 2.7% of income, and then you see that those making $1 million or about $1 million in income are paying about 0.5%, so about 1/5 of that. So, as Deb was saying, I think that income-based taxes would go a long way towards solving both of these problems, both the regressivity and the complexity of the system. And, one of the things that we found most striking about what the Tax Commission looked into was this idea that home value is really not a good measure of ability to pay, right? That at the low end, property values may exceed a family's net worth because they owe a lot on their mortgage and they have few other assets. And then at the high end, the primary residence is a very small slice of your total net worth. So in neither end is it a good indicator of your ability to pay. And ultimately, you're paying your taxes out of your income, and you're not selling some piece of your property to be able to pay your tax bill. So I think you probably have a pretty good sense of sort of what the general outline of the policy proposal is, but essentially all residents would pay their school taxes based on income. Tax rates would continue to work as they do now. In other words, the homestead tax rates would be determined by your per pupil spending as approved by local voters on town meeting day. That would change every year as it does now. But then house sites would be exempt from school property taxes, and your house site being your primary residence and up to 2 acres of adjacent land. And then all other property would continue to be taxed at the statewide non-residential rate. And I think the Tax Structure Commission report, I think, also looked at, and Deb touched on briefly, sort of renters would pay the school income rate, but then there'd be a credit, and that, working out the details of that transition too. But that they would also be paying the income rate, and we'd make sure they get credit for the portion of their landlord's property taxes that they're paying through their rent. So that would really move that remaining 1/3 of Vermont homeowners back into the income-based system and eliminate one of the systems. So it would be much, much fairer and a lot simpler. So, briefly, I wanted to just kind of go over a couple of the sort of more common arguments against income-based taxes that we've been hearing, which again, I think the Tax Structure Commission report did a really good job of addressing. The first is that income-based taxes are more volatile than property. And so it's a less reliable revenue source. But if you go to that next chart, this is one directly from the Tax Structure Commission report, and really found that in fact the the income tax base was actually less volatile than the property tax base between 2000 and 2018. But they're both moving around quite a bit. And I think from our perspective, what the volatility question is really about is who absorbs any volatility that exists. Is it the state absorbing it, or is it the taxpayer absorbing it? So from the state's perspective, the property revenue is going to look more stable because we adjust the rates every year to get what we need, right? So we're going to get the revenue that we need sort of regardless of whether the property tax base is shrinking or growing. But from the taxpayer's perspective, you want your tax bill to go down if your income goes down, right? People are paying, again, you're paying your taxes out of your income and not your property value. So it makes sense that you want that tax bill to move with your income rather than your property value. And the second, I think, most common concern is about relying too much on income-based taxes. And I think for us, this is sort of two concerns that are conflated, right? The first is this sort of idea of how much the whole revenue system in general is reliant on income-based taxes. Thinking that you want sort of a diversified revenue system so that if you have something like a global pandemic and all of a sudden you have no meals and rooms tax revenue, right? Like that there are other taxes that help absorb that, and you're not relying too much on any one piece. But the second concern, I think, that also sort of gets rolled into this is this worry about Vermont being perceived as a high income tax state. So on the first part, that next slide really gives you an idea of what the overall shift would be in terms of moving from property-based taxes to income-based taxes. So really, it's a pretty modest shift from 32% income-based to 36% income-based. And these are, again, these are sort of estimates. It's not a huge shift. So if total state revenues are in the $4 billion range, we're really talking about moving 150 million to 200 million from a property base to an income base. So it's not a huge shift. Again, it's not touching that non-homestead residential, the non-homestead property tax piece, which is about 40% of the ed fund. And then the second concern about sort of if Vermont is a high tax state, I think the first thing to remember is that we do have a progressive income tax system. So it's not a high tax state for low and middle income people. And then sort of the kind of, concern about whether that either pushes people out of the state or dissuades people from moving to Vermont. All the research is pretty clear on this, including our own analysis of Vermont migration, as well as sort of all the national studies on this, that state income taxes really aren't, or state income-based taxes really aren't factoring into people's decisions in terms of moving. So I think a lot of good work has gone into showing the benefits of an income-based system and alleviating a lot of the concerns about it. So we're glad this conversation is moving forward. And as both Representative Kornheiser and Deb referred to, I do think that sort of doing all these, there's enough overlap between these conversations that it makes some sense to do them at the same time. I think what you're doing here is really recognizing that a fair system of who pays what is very much tied to how much communities feel like they can invest in their schools and how those decisions get made. So we really do have this sort of baseline equity in our education funding system, but it is very complicated and it could be made a lot simpler, and this would go a long way in that direction. So, the way that we think about this is that income-based taxes really get to that kind of statewide level playing field piece of students having access to the whole pot, taxpayers being treated fairly and consistently. And so as you were saying in the intro, sort of within the community, which individuals are paying what really makes a big difference in terms of the impact of any changes that you make. So I think income-based taxes would correct that current unfairness in terms of the regressivity and make it a whole lot simpler. So I think they're both really critical improvements to the system. And, we hope we can make progress on both of them this year. So I hope that's helpful. We're happy to, dig into any of this. I know we're trying to stay out of the weeds, but I know that's hard in any of these conversations. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Are there questions at this point from anyone? I actually have a question if no one else does. Okay, so I'm looking at the pie charts of the percentage of the different revenue sources for funding schools. And the shift from 32% to 36%, just the 4% increase in income tax versus property tax. Why is it only 4%? Can you explain that? In my mind, it seems like it would be more.
Right. So this is all of state revenue. So again, in a $3.5–4 billion system we're talking about. So if the homestead slice of the ed fund pot is about 400 million, give or take, combined between sort of what's paid based on a property basis and what's paid based on an income basis, right? So these numbers are from FY18, just because that's the most recent sort of detailed data that we have, but it's roughly, sort of roughly the same proportions each year. But so of that 400 million, give or take, that's the homestead share of the ed fund pot. In FY18, it was about a 60-40 split. 60% was people paying based on income, and about 40% which was about $150 million, was on a property basis. So that's really all you're shifting from a property base to an income base, that 150 million in homestead taxes. Everything else stays the same. So in a $4 billion state revenue system, 150 million to 200 million only adds up to a couple of percentage points.
Okay, so one thing I didn't get first was that this is all of state revenues, not just ed fund money. This is the entire state, and it doesn't include federal dollars, though.
Correct. Right.
Okay, that makes more sense. Are there other questions for Stephanie or Jack? Did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
No, I'm just here to, if I can help to answer a question. But
okay.
On that last point, we're looking at the mix of all state revenues. And, the question is, are you becoming too dependent on income-based taxes? So that
all state tax revenues, excluding federal, which, as you know, federal is a pretty big slice of our pie.
Right.
Senator Perchlik has a question.
I have two questions. One is a more serious question than the other, and that is there already, there's a bill, people have proposed this before. It's not a new idea, right? So we have legislative language examples out there. Is that right?
So
do you have suggestions?
It is right. And there's a couple different versions over the years that have popped up. The one that was introduced this year, I think, is the one most closely aligned with what, was sort of based on what the Tax Structure Commission recommended. And we can go into more detail about that if you want, but that's pretty close to what we're proposing. Previous versions have not actually eliminated the two systems, but have just opened income sensitivity to all. So it kind of leaves that underlying complexity of the calculation. So there have been a couple different versions, but the latest version that was in the House this past session is based on the Tax Structure Commission recommendations and this plan.
Okay, and my less serious question is, I want to know if Jack is actually in Deb Brighton's barn.
I'm actually quite a bit farther away from, quite far away from Deb Brighton's barn.
That's how I envisioned it looking.
You're gonna have a dance in Deb.
He'd learn a lot if he was there.
I don't know if you all listened the day where Deb had pulled some mimeographs from Act 60 out of her barn and showed them with us, but it's become our favorite joke.
Yeah, we're gonna meet Deb Brighton's barn. Okay, other more serious questions or comments or anything? There is more testimony that was supposed to be in person, but he couldn't join us. Jeff Cannon from the Vermont NEA submitted written testimony, which you can find. It's a one-page memo on our website if you're interested in their perspective on this. I guess I'm going to just open it up for the task force about how we want to proceed. What we had hoped to do, like a lot of our hopes and dreams, was to have time to have Deb model this so we could actually see the numbers and how it impacted different types of taxpayers. Unfortunately, we due to a number of circumstances in terms of getting the data and time that has been pulled in so many different directions. We are not going to be able to have that ready for our time together. But we could still include recommendations as to this in our report. So wondering where we're at. Do you mind shutting that door? Thanks, Carol. Yes, Representative Beck. Thank you. Just one second.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you, Stephanie and Jack. I think we're going to move to conversation at this point, but please hang out if you'd like. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
I would certainly, as part of our report, I would certainly support directing JFO to model this on top of what we'll be recommending. Maybe might not be done by the time we last meet, but January.
Okay. How's everyone feeling about that? You're comfortable, Randy? You too? Yeah, Peter? Okay. Yeah, I think it won't be done by the time we're done. Deb and Brad are also working on FY23 numbers for the December 1st memo and for school districts to use to develop their budgets. And so we obviously don't want to hinder that work too. So, but we can certainly put recommendations in to move forward with this. Are there other specific things that we want to say? I know Representative Kornheiser has, do you have more specific things you want to add? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Is there anything else? Am I forgetting something?
I don't think I'm forgetting.
Okay.
There are a million things I have to do, but I don't.
Yeah. All right. So we're at 2:07. I think that didn't take as long as I think we thought it might take. We can certainly put recommendations in to model this and move in this direction. But not specific recommendations, given we haven't seen the numbers yet. But I do want to get back to a little bit more on our conversation from this morning that we started and then stopped for lunch about the recommendations we're interested in seeing in the report.
5-minute stretch break.
Sure.
I don't know if
Let's-
it's just me. I'm feeling like a little
Need a stress.
stretch break.
A stress break, stretch break. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute stretch break. So it is 2:08. If